It's 2 months since Hamas launched terror attacks on Israel. More than 1,200 people were killed during those attacks and around 240 people taken hostage.
Barrage of rockets fired out of Gaza into Israel started almost exactly 2 hours ago.
In Gaza, more than 15,000 have been killed in the Israeli response, and today the war continues as Israel seeks to eliminate Hamas. We've taken a look back at some of the key moments of the war so far. Just after dawn on Saturday the 7th of October, thousands of Hamas fighters broke through the border fence and made their way to the kibbutzim and towns on the Israeli side of the Gaza Strip. For hours they went through the villages, murdering people, torching houses and taking hostages.
I lost everything. I just want that life is back.
Waves of fighters kept coming, some of them by sea, and it took Israel's military days to secure their borders. The United States, Israel's closest ally, immediately came to its defense, condemning the terror attacks and supporting Israel's right to defend itself.
My commitment to Israel's security and the safety of the Jewish people is unshakable. The United States has Israel's back.
Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, declared his country was at war and told Israelis to prepare themselves for a long fight ahead.
The images of the destruction in the Hamas strongholds in Gaza are only the start. We have eliminated hundreds of terrorists, and we will not stop there.
300,000 reservists were called up, many flying back to Israel to serve their nation. Israel's combat operations focused on the north of Gaza first. The IDF dropped thousands of leaflets urging civilians to flee south of the Wadi Gaza.
These are being dropped for the remaining residents in Gaza right now.
It's estimated that more than 1 million people in Gaza are now displaced and living in temporary accommodation. Israeli airstrikes over Gaza continued relentlessly. By some estimates, 25,000 tons of explosives were dropped in the first weeks of the war, making it the largest bombing campaign since the Second World War. At the Rafah border crossing between Gaza and Egypt, thousands gathered to try and leave.
The situation is threatening my life and everybody's life.
But Israeli airstrikes forced Egypt to close the border, meaning that nobody could get out and humanitarian aid couldn't get in.
You can see here some of the trucks. These are Egyptian trucks. You can see the Egyptian plates on them here. All of these trucks are filled with humanitarian aid.
In mid-October, President Biden flew into Israel to meet leaders and show his support for the country. But in a televised speech, he urged Israel not to make its decisions based on anger.
Justice must be done. But I caution this: while you feel that rage, don't be consumed by it.
In late October, Hamas unexpectedly released the first 4 hostages, a mother and her daughter and 2 elderly women. Behind the scenes, talks to release a bigger number of hostages continued for weeks more. As Israel's air campaign continued, the number of civilian deaths rose rapidly. Although figures released by the health ministry in Gaza were disputed by Israel as being exaggerated by Hamas, the United Nations said that thousands of women and children were among the dead and patients in hospital were dying due to a lack of medicine. On the 27th of October, Israel's ground invasion began. Soldiers, tanks and armoured vehicles moved into northern Gaza as the next phase of the war started.
In addition to the attacks that we carried out in recent days, ground forces are expanding their activity this evening. The IDF is acting with great force in all directions.
The IDF focus turned to Gaza's largest hospital, Al-Shifa. They claimed it was being used by Hamas and a command and control centre was hidden in a network of tunnels underneath. The military operations in the hospital were widely condemned, with critically ill patients and medical staff trapped inside.
How do you evacuate over 100 patients with burns over 40% of their body surface area?
But Israel insisted it was justified under international law because the hospital was being used by Hamas for military purposes. Israel uncovered a tunnel running under part of the hospital and weapons inside the hospital itself, but found no fighters or hostages there. On the 1st of November, the Rafah border crossing temporarily opened to let foreign nationals and critically wounded leave Gaza. Around the world, including in London and Washington, tens of thousands took to the streets to protest against the high civilian death toll in Gaza and call for a ceasefire. Under international pressure to protect lives, the IDF introduced daily 4-hour pauses in fighting in some sections of northern Gaza. They told civilians which routes to take in order to move south, but there were reports that Hamas was stopping civilians from doing so, and many residents decided to stay at home because they believed they would actually be safer there. When the Shifa hospital in Gaza City lost power, some of those most at risk were premature babies, whose incubators stopped working as fuel ran out. 31 babies were saved, and some of them evacuated from Gaza across the Rafah crossing in their incubators. They were transferred to Egyptian hospitals for specialist care. After weeks of negotiations mediated by Qatar and Egypt, Israel and Hamas agreed a deal to free at least 50 hostages held inside Gaza in exchange for 150 prisoners held by Israel. This was the moment that 9-year-old Ohad Munda realized he was home and ran into the arms of his waiting father.
They're telling us their stories, and we're listening, and we're exciting with them, sometimes crying with them.
They also agreed an initial 4-day ceasefire to pause fighting within Gaza. That temporary truce was extended twice. Ultimately, it lasted for 7 days. In that time, more than 100 hostages held inside Gaza were released by Hamas. The majority of them Israeli women and children, but also people from Thailand, Russia, and other countries. Just before 7 a.m. on the 1st of December, minutes before the truce was due to expire, rockets were fired from Gaza into southern Israel. Shortly after that, the Israeli military resumed its ground operations. In reply, Hamas fired volleys of rockets into central and southern Israel in a show of defiance. Actually, there's more rockets coming out now. I don't know whether Olivia can pick that out on her camera. So we should probably just take cover. You can hear the roar of the interception missiles going out the Iron Dome. Neil, we're going to leave the camera running and I can keep talking to you here. In Gaza, many more civilians have been killed since the fighting resumed, and thousands are now living in temporary shelters as winter approaches and the weather turns cold and wet. From the start, Israel set out 2 objectives: to rescue the hostages and to eliminate Hamas. So far, it's yet to achieve either of those. It is unclear how much longer the war can go on for. Israel says it might take a few more months, but Washington has warned they may only have weeks before international pressure grows too strong. What is certain is that the days ahead will see more severe fighting, and the humanitarian crisis in Gaza will worsen once again.